Oxford start knowing themselves as Mumbai of London. इतक्या प्रमाणात म्हणजे आपण पुण्याला विद्यार्थी मला लंडन ऑफ काहीतरी म्हणतो ऑक्सफर्ड ऑफ इंडिया म्हणतो त्या बेसिसवर मुंबईमध्ये जर असे 600-700 पेपर एका कॉन्फरन्समध्ये होत असतील तर ऑक्सफर्डला असं वाटायला लागेल की आपल्यालाच काहीतरी मुंबई म्हणून घ्यायला हवं तर इथपर्यंत मला त्याच्याबद्दल झालेलं होतं इम्प्रेशन पण म्हणून तर मला असं नव्हतं करायचं की हे वर्कशॉप आपल्याला असं माहीत करायचं नाहीये हाऊ मेनी ऑफ द स्टुडंट्स अँड पार्टिसिपंट्स आर देअर दे विल डेफिनेटली टेक इट अहेड So they all have to be there with that efforts and with that आकांक्षा. खरं म्हणजे efforts पेक्षा संस्कृतमध्ये हा शब्द जास्त चांगला आहे त्यासाठी आणि त्यामुळं इथे जे काही आपण शिकलो आहे ते आपण घर येणार या जिद्दीने शिकलो आहोत आणि my friend Dr. Nikita joined us just now. She was the person who suggested why not we think of taking it ahead and publishing a volume based upon the discussions whatever will be happening over here. Then I said, okay, good, means that is not something I am looking forward. Then how to do it? Then Makaran came forward and said, okay, we can take it with Springer. So if not in the form of workshop proceedings, maybe in the form of books or monograph. So we all will try for that and everybody who has given a presentation over is committed to guide us to publish it in the form of an article contributed to the monograph of the book. And therefore, my idea was there have to be a chairperson, there have to be the reporter and the speaker. So team of you is already formed for each of the session. So I expect that they all will take it ahead and try to submit the good quality contribution within the next 3 months. And obviously, our students will make them join the groups and get it done. So I request. So therefore, Nikita is also blessed to chair the last session. She couldn't come for last 2 days. Her child was hospitalized. Every time she was telling me, "I'm feeling so bad. I'm not able to come. Can I go online?" I said, "Don't do that. We will provide you recording." That state of mind, I don't expect her to be observing what is happening in the workshop. So Nikita, please come forward. Let me at least show your face to the audience. Nikita was my colleague in the department who completed PhD very recently and then after marriage she is now in US and for a short while she was here and in that she motivated us to take up to this level. So thank you Nikita for all these contributions. Yes, whenever you are there we always feel comfortable. So I am taking this opportunity to give you this as a token of our love to you. So all the best. Over to David, sir.
All right. Yes. Three, yes. All right. Yesterday, reviewing the first day, we discussed the aesthetic map, the aesthetic considerations when it comes to producing music, specifically how one processes the signal in order to come up with a commercial sound, a sound which is broadly popular. Yesterday, we started on talking about approaches that could be executed either in an analog fashion or a digital fashion, but most of what we were talking about were techniques where the preferable way, if budget allows, is to execute in an analog fashion. But we didn't quite finish it, so there's one thing I want to talk about. Transformers. Now, we're all familiar with transformers as what we do for, as far as powering whatever equipment we have, this and that and whatnot. And if you think that there would be no place in the signal path to put transformers, from an engineering standpoint, you would be right. I mean, they're terrible. They are replete with just about every kind of nonlinearity you can imagine. But we're dealing with a subject where considerations are often determined by aesthetics and a market, and not by simple engineering. So, and we're also dealing with the situation that for much of the last 100 years, There were transformers throughout the entire signal path that ran from the microphone in the studio right into the speaker in the user's household. Now, since the 1960s, there has been a decline in the number of transformers in this long, long signal path. The result being from an engineering standpoint, because it was improved fidelity, but from an aesthetic and commercial standpoint, people have made it very clear that the music is not sounding like they expected it to sound like. Now, even though the transformer has almost disappeared in the consumer side of this chain, that means it's now up to the production side of this chain to have a judicious use of transformers in order to give the people the sound that they are expecting to hear. Now, there are companies that have been, like this one, for instance, that has been making transformers for audio work for quite a long time. Let's go on to the next one. And look at the prices that people are paying for a single transformer. Now, these are all dollars. Multiply them by 70, and you see that they're very expensive, and that's why you do not find them in the signal path at the consumer side. But it's something we really need to think about from a production side. Now, one of the things that is curious is they're nonlinear in every fashion. First of all, in terms of dynamics, they will saturate like any other device will saturate. They have nonlinearities due to the fact that they are, of course, inductive, but because of the very, very thin insulation on the wires, they're also capacitive. And then they're resistive. So when you have a transformer in your hand, you're basically looking at a very, very complicated resonance device that you don't even know how it's going to perform until you actually put it into a circuit. Even things going on around it will influence the way it works. With transformers from an engineering standpoint, in the signal path, audio nightmare. But it's something we still have to do because the audience expects a certain amount of transformer distortion, or let's just say color, in the signgle path. Let's look at some of the interesting things. Next one. This is a high-end microphone preamplifier, and this is a high-end price. These are dollars. These are not rupees. So multiply it by 70 or 71, and you're looking at something very expensive. Next picture. You notice also in terms of the aesthetics, the design aesthetics, it takes us back to the 1940s. It is an aesthetic which is very, very dominant in the production field. Next one. Now look at this. It's hard to see, but this is a 3-position switch. When the switch is in the upper position, you're using a nickel core transformer. When the switch is in the middle position, you're using an iron core transformer. And when the switch is in the bottom position, you're using a steel core transformer. Okay? That's simply because the transformer has become such an important part in determining what kind of sound you have. Engineers want to have the ability to choose between the nickel, iron, or steel sound. From a purely engineering standpoint, this machine is insane. But as I say, we're dealing with a field which is driven primarily by aesthetics and market, and not by simple engineering considerations. Before we leave transformers, any questions? Okay, next question. Let's look at this. This is a signal processor. Go back one more. Okay. Let's look at this. This is a very simple example of a processor. Go back to the earlier one. And it's nothing in the world but transformers and bypass switches. There's no active components in this whatsoever. All we're doing is passing the signal through the transformer and out. That's it. Completely passive. Again, this is a machine that from an engineering standpoint makes no sense at all, but from a commercial and artistic standpoint, it makes perfect sense. Okay, next one. All right. Right now, we finished talking about all the different things that can be done in an analog fashion. A lot of things that many times the business says should be done in an analog fashion. But getting something which is more germane to this workshop, from now on we're going to be talking about techniques that really cannot or should not be done in an analog fashion. They're either impossible or have become so awkward we just wouldn't consider it. So right now, we're going to discuss time-based processing. Next one. Let's look at just a simple delay. It's really nothing in the world, but if we put an impulse on here, run it through the delay, after a certain period of time, we get the output. Now, there are many things that we can do with this, but one of the most common ones is to use as like a chorus effect, but it's also useful in just purely musical and compositional for compositional reasons. Now, there's a fundamental weakness in this thing in that all we're getting is a delayed signal. So without anything to form a reference in our mind, it's not much use. So let's look at the next one. Let's stop and see how historically the delay was implemented. Here we have a piece of tape that just goes like that in a loop. And it's based on the fact that the record head and playback head are offset. And so you'll get a delay, which is a function of this distance and the tape speed. This is how delays were implemented from the 1950s, actually. Next one. As I said, this is how it is. It's basically you pass a tape bit. It's recorded on here, a fraction of a second later. It's played back. Very straightforward, and is the origin of a lot of these musical effects, but it's essentially impossible nowadays. The origin of a lot of these, but it's to have your heads. Now you can actually move the position of the head. You can change. You have your heads. Now you can actually move the position of the head as well as the speed of the tape. So this is much more flexible, but this was the way delays were introduced. So this is much more flexible, but this was the way delays were introduced. Next. Probably, I think, in the late 60s. Now, the problem with the tape delays historically has been you have moving parts. Now, the problem with the tape delays historically has been you have moving parts. So, in 1971, the Cooper time tube was introduced. So, and it's really nothing in the world but links of garden hose, for which one end has a microphone and the other end has a speaker. And the Cooper time tube was very important for two reasons. One is that it was reliable. You could use it in the studio day in and day out. There was nothing to wear out. But curiously enough, it had a very strong coloration. You can imagine that the resonance implied by having a length of garden tube would make for a device that was extremely colored. Now, I bring that up now because even though we wouldn't consider using a Cooper time tube in production work today, if you're going to sell any kind of delay type device or any type of software for echoes and delays and everything, this is something that you should be emulating. Next one. Okay, 1969, the Bucket Brigade device was introduced, which is a sort of a cross between a digital and analog device. What it is it would take a signal and break it up into analog samples, not digital, analog samples, and pass them from one capacitor to another. See these capacitors right here? It was like switches, and we just keep passing this analog sample down the chain, hence the name Bucket Brigade device. They were terrible. They sounded absolutely horrible, but they were economical, and you could get a delay effect for your studio, or they would be very small and would not cost a lot of money, but they had a very particular sound. This too is something that there are people out there who are selling and giving away plugins in order to emulate the sound of these Bucket Brigade devices. Any questions? Okay, next. All right, now we get to something which is a little more practical. Just a simple delay is not terribly useful because we don't have a sense of reference. But if we take the initial signal coming in, and if we sum it with the delayed signal, then being able to listen to the two together makes much more sense from an artistic standpoint. Now, one thing that's interesting, let's look at this delay here. Because of some tricks of psychoacoustic tricks, this delay really needs to be greater than about around 40 to 50 milliseconds. If it becomes less than that, you no longer hear the second sound, you only hear the first one. So all kinds of funny things will happen, like these sort of things can affect your sense of pan, where the signal is coming from in the stereo field, but it may not actually come as a second sound to your mind because of something known as, if memory serves me well, something like the Haas effect. I don't think I'm spelling it right, but you can all look it up on the internet. Let's go another. Okay, a very classic implementation of an echo would be not just a summation of the delay signal and the input signal. Incidentally, the term used in the studio is wet and dry. Wet for your affected signal, and then dry for your original unaffected signal. So, more than just having a mixture of your delay signal, your wet signal, and your dry signal, if you again take some of the delay signal, bring it back and sum it again with our input signal. Now, with the proper scaling factor, then we'll sort of have an exponential decay like this. Now, this is an echo. Now, I bring this up because, especially in India, for some reason in the studios, there's been a tendency to use reverb and echo as being synonymous. Well, they're not really synonymous. This is actually an echo. What constitutes an echo is that each one of these maintains its coherence. There's really very little convolution of the signal. Let's look at the next one. If you keep the same overall architecture, but reduce the delay time, if the delay time is small enough, from a psychoacoustic standpoint, it resembles a real reverberation, but it still does not really convolute the signal that well. Another thing that's problematic is if you've ever listened to it, it really does not sound very good at all. Yes? Is it coherent? Is it a very coherent echo, or is it just sort of like an like a reverberance? If it loses all its coherence, then from an aesthetic standpoint, it's a reverb. If it's a coherent signal that comes again and again and again, that's echo. That's really the difference between an echo and a reverb. From a technical standpoint, this comes pretty good to imitating what we want. The only problem is it doesn't sound good. So let's bring it to the next one. If we introduce a pre-delay, now we've got something which is useful in the studio, where we have our initial signal as just the dry signal coming through. There is a pre-delay determined by this delay here, and then we have our exponential decay from our previously described signal. Now, again, the problem here is even though we have shortened it to the point where it resembles a reverb, it's still not a reverb. Still, this does not have a very heavy convolution. Do you all understand what we mean by convolution? Okay, let's put it this way. I mean, in other words, when things become mixed together to the point where it becomes a very difficult matter to try and deconvolute it. Okay, that would be the simplest way I could think of it. Okay, the next one. Now, if we want to get fancier, if we have different delay lines with different parameters, then we get something where we really have a much more easily convoluted signal. Next. Let's go in and see what has inspired a lot of this interest in reverb and delay. This was an echo chamber, and that's not really an echo chamber, it's a reverb chamber. You see a speaker here, you see two microphones, these are ribbon microphones. It is a room, and the room is totally dedicated towards producing reverb. This is what high-end studios used back in the 50s and 60s. Next. Now, this is another interesting thing. This one is called a plate reverb. You basically just have a big plate. It has metal goods very, very loosely held into place. The plate has essentially a couple of speakers elements attached to it and a couple of microphone transducers, and you can shift them around. And when the plate begins to vibrate, then you have a real absolute reverb-like sound. It's very heavily, very highly convoluted signal. And this is the only one of the analog reverbs that you will still find in use today. Everything else in terms of reverbs is all digitally implemented. But this is one where if you got the money, you got the money. Remember that's US $1,000. If you got the money, you got to have a real analog reverb. For most everybody else, reverb sound is a ubiquitous setting on reverb software or your reverb outside processor. Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, next. The spring reverb. The spring reverb, as I mentioned yesterday, that was invented by Hammond. You basically have a spring under tension. You have a element on one side, you have a microphone element, transducer on the other, spring just back and forth. And that was how you convolute the signal that way. The spring reverb is also a very, very common setting on your reverb units, even though I've not seen one actually used in real life in many, many years. Next. Now, this is an effect that you can only do in the digital domain, where if you have your input signal, and instead of the exponential decay, you have an exponential rise. Now, you will not find this in the real world. There's no real world analog whatsoever. But that's one reason why this has become very commonly used whenever you're dealing with ghost movies and things like that. Both, you hear it in Bollywood films, Hollywood films, whenever they want some spooky, ghost-like thing, you can feel the the reverb coming before the sound actually occurs. Well, that's how they're doing it. This is just a reverb which is reverse. In the old days of tape machines, you could record your sound, reverse the tape on the machine, then record the reverb, then record it back, when you turn it back, reverse reverb. But you can understand that, even though it has been done, it's not something that can be done real time passion in the real world, because that means the machine is having to read. There is no such machine. But this is an effect that you've all heard, you heard it, and recognize it instantly. Next. Now, everything we talked about so far has been essentially a simulation of the hardware we board years of some right now that provides the aesthetic roadmap for what we want to do. But since we're dealing with a digital domain, it's a different thing. You see, delay lines were very, very, very expensive back 40 years ago. And so if you wanted to get the maximum bang for the buck, whatever delay line you had in design. Today, a delay line is nothing right into a buffer, and some fraction of a second later reading back the same buffer. It's cheap, it's not computationally intensive, so we're not limited by the number of delay lines we want to have. We can have any number of delay lines we want, with any kind of delay that we want. We can sum them with any kind of scaling that we want, and we can really come up with very, very, very good convolution to give us any kind of sound that we want. Okay. Everything that we've been doing so far is an algorithmic approach. But there's another approach. Convolution reverbs. Okay, next one. Now, the convolution reverb, you basically create an impulse response file. One way that that's done is like you go into a big auditorium and you take a starter pistol or something, you fire, and you record it, and you record the response of the room. That gives you an impulse file. You use this impulse file as a roadmap to convolute the input of your signal. So this is done totally digitally. It's very, very common, and it produces some of your most natural reverbs that you could possibly want. Next. All right, now let's leave that and let's go to time stretching and compression. This is something that really, I can't say that there was never any analog equivalent, but For all practical purposes, this is something that can only be done in the digital domain. It can only be done in software. Let's look at time and pitch shifting. Now, this is the first thing to remember. There is no single approach to time or pitch manipulation which works in every situation. They will all fail you under certain circumstances. If you need to be in that situation, what I mean by time and pitch shifting would be, like the Antares auto-tune, harmonizers, any granular-based type of pitch change, time change, things like that. That's what we're dealing here. Now, I can't even pretend to give you all the approaches out there. Both partly because of many of them I don't know them all. Another reason is they tend to be proprietary. So unless you're actually working with the company, the programs can be very sketchy. Resam. This is the easiest of all. Next one. Essentially, what you're doing, taking your file and resampling it. Like you want to make it shorter. You make it shorter. You resample it. Reduce the number of samples. You have increased the pitch. At the same time, you have decreased the length. And if you resample the other direction, you can take it and resample it to increase the length and then lower the pitch. Now, next one. Let's look at the advantages. Simplest algorithm implement. It'll work on the slowest machine you've got. It produces no unpleasant artifacts. Now the only bad thing about it is you have no separate control of pitch and time. Absolutely none. It's essentially analogous to taking a tape machine and speeding it up or slowing it down. Now, time domain harmonic shifting. This is also known as overlap and add. This is pretty simple in its overall philosophy. You determine a period. Okay. You take that period. You just take a sample of that from your period. You resample it again, same way before. If you resample it to increase the size, you slow the pitch down. I didn't say slow the music down. You reduce the pitch. And then you overlap and add. That means you convert it back into you just simply add it back over itself. All right? Next. Pros, it works well in a slower machine. The disadvantage is it fails with complex material. You're not going to be able to use this well with polyphonic material because there's invariably going to be estimations of the signal. Next. Frame-based time shifting. Next. Okay, this is how it works. Let's say you have your original signal. You take different frames, as indicated here. Let's say you want to make it longer. You spread them apart, and then again you add them all together. And so you're able to take this sample here, you're able to slow it down without changing the pitch. It's independent. Next one. All right, so far everything that we've done in the time domain. But you see, there's also no surprise that a lot of your pitch shifting or time shifting is going to be done in the frequency domain. This is again where there's a lot of different approaches. The phase vocoder. Next. Essentially what you do is you take your signal, you perform a Fourier transform on it. Then, when you do that, you've got all these little blocks. You take these blocks, and you do whatever you want to. Usually, you're simply resampling them. And then you perform an inverse transform, an inverse Fourier transform. And that's basically it. Next one. Okay. Did we skip one? Yes, go back. Yeah. All right. Did I not discuss the advantages and disadvantages? Next one. No, go back. All right. Okay. But we'll stop here. Now, what this does is this tends to produce a lot of artifacts and complex material. Other than that, it was fine. Next one. I'm doing it. Next one. Okay. Now, advantages can be done in real time on modern well on some types of material. The disadvantage of this approach is that it does not have franges very well. That means if you guitar or something like that, it tends to smear the attacks. If you look at tabla or sitar, it'll look like that. You have a very strong frangent at the tops, and then it decays. Well, these smear, and it doesn't work very well. I think that's all that I talked about. But that's pretty much all I want to talk about. Now, anything over the days, do you have any questions over anything? Any questions at all? Then okay, yes. Delays. We're talking about going back to the time. Go back. This area right here. Everything shifts. You see, first of all, this is all done time domain. Everything's time domain for all these delays. All we're doing here in software, the only thing that we're doing is you've got one subroutine, which is going and is writing to a buffer. And in a short amount of time, you have another subroutine, which is reading from the buffer. You're basically offsetting your memory locations by the extent of your memory, the offset, coupled with your sampling. That gives you the amount of delay you want. It's very cheap, not computationally intensive at all. Very easy to do. That's why you really don't have any limits to the number of delay lines you can deal with if you're doing everything in software. A lot of these old architectures were really developed at times when you were dealing with hardware delay lines, which were at a premium. They were not very good. They were very expensive. If you had one or two, that was really all you could do. Another thing I should mention about any of these things. These are just a starting point. They're not the end of it. You can also mix in with this kinds of filtration. So that the harmonic content can be changed. So you can also in the process granular base shifting, all kinds of fancy stuff. If you look at the number of reverbs out there, software plugins or standalone units, a number of options is mind-boggling. This is the place where you begin. This is not the place where you begin. Anyone else have any other questions? Yes. I'm sorry, what? The vocoder, phase vocoder, rest. Bonsoir voice, the reason being is when you look at real world signals. If you look at real world signals, if we look at it in the time domain, as a general rule, as much as you use it in a time domain as possible, you want to do. The reason being, it's computationally not very demanding. The moment you have to start working with frequency domain, that means you've got to Fourier transform. Then you're doing what you're going to do your Fourier transform. It takes a lot of computational effort. But anyhow, getting back, if you look a typical, let's say, sitar or tabla or something like that, the signal will tend to look like that. At the moment where you strike the drum or strike the sitar, you get a strong transient. Now, these transients tend to smear and become indistinct with a voice vocoder, which is why the moment you start to manipulate the pitch or time or anything like that with a phase vocoder, then that's the problems here. These transients don't handle very well. Does that answer your question? Whose question? Your question, yes. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you all for allowing me to come here today. Thank you very much. Bye.
All the three sessions, actually, I have learned a lot going to the evolution of those instruments, the technical details of it. But I'm not a very much the domain person. Probably the people over your very we will have something. So now it becomes a requirement to have at least one person. Is it very online students? I think we cannot. Yes. At least one has very that's good.
So, when your first lecture, when you explained theory of using measurement, did India just come up with or were all those instruments used in Indian music as well?
But in terms of your technologies for music production, everything, it didn't skip everything. It followed the same line, about the same length of time. But before the period of economic liberalization in the 80s and 90s, there may have been a lag of a few years, but it followed the same thing. But that's a good question. Yes? I'm sorry, what? What about it? I spent a lot of time there. It's probably still there. Yeah, yes, but yeah, okay, anything? Yes. Yes. There's been some very serious interest in the development. Yeah, there's been this. I have an electric sitar. The library Kumar is probably most famous for the use of an electric sitar. And he uses processes to all kinds of special effects. Also, electric Veena is there. I believe raised out of Bangalore is producing electric Veena. And there's a lot of innovation going on in the field. I mean, we tend to think that classical musicians are very much traditionalists, but there's a lot of innovation going on in the instruments and the electrification as well as the use of effects. But that's a good question. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. Yeah.
Have an AI project which generating artificial sound like Magenta did it. So what in your opinion is the best to produce that sound artificially because the Magenta AI uses a piano. I mean.
I don't know. If I did, you wouldn't be getting your PhD. So I guess that's what you have to do. Probably a good question, but I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't have an answer. I'd probably say you whatever you want. But it does bring up some of my students. I have one student. He's 80 some odd years old. Now, I'm getting him using the software programs on cell phones, and he's completely disoriented by the harmonium sound like on tour. And I can sort of put myself in this position and see why, but I would not have thought of that ahead of time. That's something Mike consider. That's a very good question. Anything else? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Well. Okay. I remember the first time I met him. I don't remember the exact date. It was either it was summer of, I believe, 1970, I believe, maybe 71. 71. At that time, would have been around 10 o'clock at night. I was answering the phones in a volunteer radio station, and he was running late for his show. He comes rushing in, and he was wearing a kurta. Remember that? And he mentioned something as he rushed by into the studio, and that was actually the first meeting right there. And he became my very good friend, and through many adventures and misadventures, we know where each other's skeletons are buried, so we have each other under control. So that's how I first met him. And he's probably the reason that I became interested in Indian music to begin with.
Okay, it's like this, that I like to listen to music, but I didn't have music listening equipment. I didn't have a turntable and all of those. In those days, we had these 33 RPM vinyl records. So Pacifica Radio used to have, Pacifica Radio is a kind of leftist radio station. It exists, I think, even now in Berkeley. It doesn't really. I'm impressed. So I had a friend who used to broadcast Saturday nights, 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. He got his PhD and left. I got in his place, and really I didn't know. I didn't feel like talking. I would just go and play some records, mostly instrumental music. Because I think we can digest it, make it digest it easier. So 10 p.m., 12 p.m., I would have a record. That's why I heard a lot of Ali Akbar Sahib and others also those days. They gave us maybe 50 LPs for free because we said, look, you want to broadcast your music over the radio. And when I left, David took over. Then later on, he came to Hyderabad. He is known as son of Gauri Bai. He found himself a wonderful guru in Sheikh Daud Sahib. Sir, have you, when you came to Pune, was he performing? Yeah. He was such a nice guy. That's all I remember about him. And he would be very friendly with me and everybody else. He had all the time in the world for everybody. If there was a music program, he'd be there 1.5 hours before time, just sitting around. And when it came time, he would play. In Savai Gandharva of those early days, he was a stock tabla there for senior musicians. And David was very lucky that he got to learn under Daud Sahib. And he had a big circle of friends. David got to know them. So now David is friendly with lot of people in Hyderabad. I don't know them. David does, even now. And, I don't know what to tell you. but he can get along just fine all over North India. Then he was lucky guy. He married this wonderful girl, Chandrakanta. She was a disciple of a senior uh, North Indian style musician called Bhima Shankar Rao. There was a small samsthan, zamindar, bigger than zamindar, smaller than a king, in a place called Hanamakonda in Warangal district. Bhima Shankar Rao was a disciple of Patwardhan Bua of Gwalir Gharana, and he was living in Hanamakonda, and Chandrakanta got to learn from Bhima Shankar Rao. I don't know who else she learned from. And you, Vinjamuri, Sita Devi, Anusuya Devi, maybe? Anusuya Devi and Sita Devi were major, properly trained in Carnatic music, but they became folk music pioneers. Sita Devi went recording. She was an all India radio artist in 1938, and she was still ticking in 1995 or so. So she would know all the folk song, kind of song they sing when you cut grass. In Mumbai University campus, I hear Telugu folk. I don't know if you know that. Do you see these Telugu speaking ladies who come around February and cut grass and all that? Have you seen them? Well, there are like a gang of 20 dark-skinned ladies wearing saris. They go in the mornings like this, and they would sing the folk song that I heard Sita Devi record and play. So, David has noticed me. David is really nice to see you. Come back. Actually paid the most important thing that I want to give given. So all I can say is wonderful section. I'm happy to come five exciting time. Last university did a similar thing. But this one is more message. We focused around what I most like doing in terms of research in physiology. And Ambuja brought together the variety of so we had a wonderful event and all the department of science, many more events, right? And that is something
तेच आहे. आणि दुसरं मला म्हणायचं की हा चालू आहे. लूट सके तो लूट ले. निधनी शोभ 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 गुरु गुरु भवपाश तुटेना गुरु भेना पवाश
याला उत्तर काय करावे? गुरु कुंभार काढी शिष्यात खोट आधार देत आधार देत आधार देत गुरु कुंभार काढी शिष्यात खोट आधार देत आधार देत आधार देत.
मॅडम छान केलं.